Let's look again then for a moment at economic development. I think this is a part of our task now, this current generation. We've gone through the slavery and through emancipation and Reconstruction, Jim Crowism, accommodationism, desegregation and civil rights laws, and in ways they have expanded our consciousness. They have allowed us to see their faults. They have allowed us to a degree to benefit from whatever benefits they had to offer. We cannot stop now in a state of confusion. We have to move on to the next step and next level of development. And for people who've been disrespected and degraded, perhaps it is not too unusual that they thought their major goal was to be loved by the people who degraded them. And they concentrated on that. For people whose confidence in themselves was lowered and whose potentials were restricted, perhaps it is understandable to a degree that they thought by attaching themselves to their former masters, they somehow could overcome their problem. We now, though, have the advantage of seeing that that is not going to solve the kind of problems that confront us. We have the advantage of hindsight. So our job is not to condemn them, but to move beyond them and to carry it another step, as our children and grandchildren will carry it beyond where we are today. And I think now, since the major issues of desegregation and accommodationism and so forth have been dealt with, it is time for us now to focus on some other issues. And one of the issues, and there are other issues, one of the issues, of course, is that of economic development and economic enterprise. Many of our people have problems with this concept of economics. Many nationalists are still wrestling with it. How do we fit it into our program? What is it about? Because many of us, nationalists and otherwise, are still identified with poverty. We still think somehow poverty is more virtuous than wealth. That poverty makes us somehow more holy, and we get self-righteous in our poverty. And we point a malnutrition finger and try to condemn those who have decided to take advantage of their natural and human resources. And we watch our children die over the world, in Africa and in the Caribbean and in America and in other places, feeling righteous about our poverty and our identification with it. We allow ourselves now to be on the very edge of extinction. And we are on the edge of extinction. I've mentioned to you many times, when you look at the science fiction movies, you can see and read the science fiction books that as the European thinks out what he's going to do with the future, the black man is not a part of it. Some of us, I don't think, recognize what a precarious position we are in as people, when blacks are really no longer needed in this country and may no longer be needed on the earth itself. We talked about how the neutron bomb was created essentially as a third world weapon to remove the human beings and leave their resources intact so that they could be utilized by the remaining people. That tomorrow, if Reagan and Gorbachev met and decided that they would rid the earth of its African inhabitants, there would be no African nation that could defend the interests of African people. In this day and age of Star Wars and weaponry moving out in space, we have yet to make the jet age in reality. And therefore, we are literally defenseless against warfare coming from space itself. we are not able to even move from one planet to another, as the European is preparing himself to do. The European is preparing to build an artificial planet, space stations, to secure his genes. And we're still just thinking about getting a job. The European is already doing geological surveys of the moon and other planets. And is already talking about mining those planets and looking at their commercial possibilities. If you go downtown around 59th Street, you can buy something called Commercial Space, a magazine called Commercial Space, dedicated to the commercial utilization of space. And we're still worried about Koreans over here in Harlem. People getting ready to take advantage of the moon. Zimbabwe is having, Zambia is having riots over there. And almost social chaos over food. And as a result of the fact that the price of copper has sunk very low, and therefore the economy has been vastly disturbed, and there's a threat of social disorganization as a result of the fact that you have an economy built around essentially one product. And the pricing of that product and the use of that product is in the hands of Europeans. And therefore they manipulate the rise and fall in organizations of nation through the manipulation of price. And of course, the estimation is that even those resources, which are the foundations of their economy at this point, that is the resources of copper, will be gone in 20 years. How do they eat then, if they are hardly eating now? How does the whole of Africa eat when its resources have been sucked out of its soil and there's no more to be exploited there? When at that point the European is now beginning to suck resources from the moon or from other places. Or as Reagan administration has made very clear, they will not give the Africans and other weak nations access to the resources of the sea. What happens after the resources are gone? So see, we have to look beyond the dream. We have to look into the future and prepare ourselves for dealing with that future. And this is our task. And we have to recognize then that a concern with economic development is at the very center of our survival as people. It's not just about getting status and getting into the American mainstream and this kind of business. It's about the pure business of surviving, feeding each other, supporting each other, and providing for our generation and the coming generations. We can no longer ignore the issue of economics. We're going to have to confront it head on and straightforward, not through some theoretical mumbo-jumbo of Marxism and all these other Eurocentric theories that some of our enlightened brothers so easily toss about and debate endlessly. And while we were going through endless debates about capitalism and Marxism and so forth, the Asians are just taking the community and working it through. We must recognize then that the center of African concern has always been economics. I don't know where we got off of this tangent. On this tangent here that economics are not the center point of any people's development, and how we became to identify with poverty. And some people have enough nerve to try to even justify it in terms of some kind of weird African philosophy. You know, you have to watch those people who jump and use Africa to cover up all their problems, you know. You have a lot of that going on today, too. That's the way the Africans did it. You know, as if that's the is all concern. ladies and gentlemen, even the way the Africans did it must come under scrutiny. I'm telling you. The mere calling back on tradition, and often the tradition many people call on is fictitious anyway, is not enough to silence the concerns that we need that confront us. And some people sort of pull that out as a last, that last and final statement. It's African. And then at that point you're supposed to cease thinking, and analyzing. And note, the African thing often appears to go along with their restrictive view of things. It's also African to be concerned about wealth. You are not going to find any, or maybe I won't be so bold, but I think it would be hard put to find any great civilization or people that also did not have a very strong social, political, economic foundation for their greatness. And in a sense, we almost want to be great, and we want to be respected, and we want to have security, and all these other things without having an economic system to back it up. And I think when you search history, you will find that economic greatness and so forth were together and combined and were reciprocally influential, one on the other. And you don't leave one out without the other. We often call on Egypt as an example. And quoting John Jackson, Introduction to African Civilizations, Egypt's first golden age was initiated by an invasion from Ethiopia. According to Chancellor Williams, the South actually had all Egypt at its mercy. The South was the real source of Egypt's wealth, as it had been of Egypt's civilization. And so we see again wealth and civilization being coterminous here. And that wealth, and it's the wealth of the South that's laying the basis for the greatness of Egyptian civilization. The gold mines were there. Appropriate organization. We see then these cultures, the African cultures and other cultures, using their economic base as the basis for their greatness and for their power. I wish I had time to go through a few things. I just want to show you a few examples of, because there's so many. This book is very rich. I like the idea here that there's very little waste on nonsense. The examples occur one right after the other. Some people are shocked, for instance, when I say that you really don't need banks to perpetuate economic growth among our people. That's not the basic need. And it's interesting to note Light's discussion of banks, and here he talks about, for instance, the first black bank occurring, I think, between 1888 and 1900. And he talks about 134 black banks, I believe, by the end of 1935. And yet, how those banks contributed little, if anything, to the economic growth and development of black people. And how the Chinese and the Japanese lost 100% of their banks, and yet progressed in their economic development. In fact, he goes on to explain how, in a way, it was the development of banks among black people in America that, in a sense, stifled their economic growth. It's interesting to look at that. It becomes interesting, too, to note that the Japanese were discriminated against in very heavy ways, pretty much the way we were discriminated against as people as well. Even laws that were passed forbidding them to purchase land. How they, too, did not get loans from banks and were turned off for credit. How they, too, now we as blacks say, well, we're so obviously non-European. So that's one reason why we are easy targets for discrimination. But I think the Japanese and Chinese are pretty obviously non-European as well. And in a sense, blacks were more familiar, I think, to whites than perhaps even the Chinese and the Japanese were. And yet, despite this lack of so-called banks and the whole bit, the Japanese were able to develop economically and develop and outstrip in terms of the percentage of people engaged in business and other things, even their white counterparts. And we see today, if you look at them as a group, their earning power is higher than that of whites. And we can name other groups. Of course, the so-called West Indian group is of interest in this regard as well. Part of the educating of our people may be in a business course, the educating of each other into trust and faith and confidence and self-knowledge and building social relationships and connections and networks. And therefore, the dry course that's taught in the white Eurocentric university is not quite enough to be a foundation for black economic development, because the crucial elements which they do not teach in school, but which are the essential elements of their economy, are not being taught there, and they have to be taught and learned at some place. Those are taught. I tell people often that the white system has two systems of education: the formal one and then the informal one. The unrealistic one called college and high school, and the realistic one called life. And you see, even if a black were to get an equal education and learn exactly the same thing that a white learns in this school, he would still be at a disadvantage. Because as the New York lottery goes, you got to be what? In it to win it. I'm telling you. And so, even though you have this degree and you have this knowledge, if you're not really inside, if you're not really active and doing something, you're still not going to know it. Because the lesson in civics is not realistic in terms of how activities are really taking place down at City Hall. And so therefore your good white liberal professor who's so nice to you and so non-racial and so loving can afford to be, because his brother got control of the real world. And because his brother has control of the real world, he can act the liberal part, you see. And then you can say, well, y'all hate white folk, and I know some good white folk, and, and my professor was great to me, and not all white, when we get into all of that confusion, because, these leftists, these white leftists have projected themselves onto us and showing how nice white folk can be. While in reality, their rightist brothers have control of the economy. And so after that white boy leaves, he learns about what the real world is. And he literally almost throws away what he's learned in college. He just used that as basic concept. And now he's taught the real act of doing business. And that part, though, if we're not in it or don't study it hard and gather intelligence, we will never know about, you see. And therefore we confuse formal equality of formal education with real equality of education. And therefore the educating of a black economics graduate, you see, must be an education into reality, and must be an education carried on by people, not because they have degrees or they're in colleges and universities, but who've been parts and partial of activities and so forth, and can apprentice and mentor and bring people in and show them the realities of what is going on in the world. Now, I'll end it with this, and so we have to understand this kind of thing. And we'll see then that an understanding, a realistic understanding, realistic education is necessary for the development of our people. That the realistic economic development of African Americans is necessary for Pan-African development as well. Now, I see a lot of Negroes hide behind this black nationalism as an excuse to do nothing. Man, I'm not a part of this country. I'm going back to Africa. Chances are you're not going back anywhere. And let's face the reality of the situation. And then, but you're going to use that bravado to make an excuse for doing nothing. And therefore, I'm not going to engage in any kind of economic or social development or anything like that because this is a part of the American. Have you ever thought about taking over the system? Of subverting the system? That never occurs to us, The white South Africans run South Africa even though they are a minority because they have a connection with the other whites in the world. And simply because you're an African minority in this system doesn't mean that you can't get control of it. You see, we don't want to visualize it that way. We want to run from it. We have to face the fact that this is an economic giant still. Even though it's limping, it still is an economic giant in the world, ladies and gentlemen. And it still has a lot of juice left. That's right. Because as America stumbles and falls, the other world stumbles and falls. Why are the Japanese worried about the falling dollar? Because the Japanese are an exporting nation, and their whole nation depends upon export. And if the United States stop buying their products, they're going to have problems over there. Instead, and there are all other issues going on in this area that we should try to get to understand very quickly here. What we must recognize then, and the United States now is pushing Germany to stimulate its economy. Why? Because you see, it is through the stimulation of those economies that the other nations of the world also are stimulated into economic growth and development. We must understand that, like people in America, what our role is in relationship to the economic development of Africans. Just merely throwing away the economic possibilities here behind some half-thought-out African nationalism is not going to make it. The stimulation of black economic development in America can be a part of the stimulation of black economic development everywhere in the world. And you must look at it and see what that really means.